Welcome to Israel, Inside to Israel and Beyond. My name is Anna Mace. I'm filling in for Michael Ganu today, and our subject today is going to be manufacturing consent. What is manufacturing consent? Manufacturing consent refers to gaining public approval for government policies by using mass media. And the expert on this is going to be Tamara Hammond. Tamara Hammond, hi, and welcome to the show.
Hi.
Tamara is a PhD. She has a PhD in world cultures and world languages from University of Utah. And she is a former adjunct professor at the University of Utah. And she is an author of multiple publications on media. So she's going to be our expert on this subject today. The reason why this is such an important subject is because for the past 5 years, we all have seen several events taking place. And if you think about this, these events have cost the American taxpayers and other Western taxpayers billions and trillions of dollars. They resulted in huge outflow of money. And me, as an expert on following the money, I can tell you that these outflows, if the public knew the truth, would not be supported by the public. They would be the government would be faced with resistance and with perhaps even an outcry by the taxpayers, an outrage, because if they had known the truth, if the truth was presented by the mass media to the consumer, which is mostly most citizens, the public would be outraged. However, that's not how things works, do they, Tamara?
Exactly. And the main culprit here, I would say, it's propaganda. And usually we associate propaganda with dictatorships like fascism or communism, whereas Western propaganda is never mentioned, and we know very little about it. And that's why today I'm going to emphasize propaganda, which is conveyed by the media, and they're the main culprit here. So,
and if I may interject, both of us, Tamara and I, come from the old Soviet bloc, where we knew that we were under the authoritarian regimes, and these authoritarian regimes are framed as the culprits of the axis of evil. Right? That's how they call them nowadays.
Yeah.
The axis of evil, Russia, China, Iran, this is where, the public is under full control of the government. And of course, the media is owned by the government as well. The lies are being told. These people are being fooled. But us, on the other hand, here in the West, we are in democracies. We should trust the government. We trust the media. They can't be telling us lies. Is that so, Tamara?
However, I would say the communist regimes, people under communist regimes were at advantage because we knew what's going on. Whereas in Western societies, people are completely brainwashed. They don't even know what's going on. And that's exactly the goal of propaganda. And that's why it's so subtle and so sophisticated. And I would actually argue that we don't live in democracy here in the West. I would argue that we live in a plutocracy, which is a government by the wealthy, for the wealthy, and of the wealthy. That's the definition of plutocracy. And it was been proven multiple times, most recently in 2014. A Princeton study showed that only 10 to 20% of US citizens participate in government policies, whereas the remaining 80 to 90% have little to none existent influence. So that's exactly the definition of plutocracy.
Wow. And what role? So the power of the policy making belongs to that very top privileged 10 to 20%, right?
Correct. And through the media and the ideology of the ruling classes is been implemented, and it's been instilled in people's consciousness. So this invisible control and this pseudo propaganda is the reason why people are not rising up, and they're lulled to believe that they live in democracy, they're free, etc. So our goal here is to debunk this myth about democracy, meritocracy, etc. But in order to do this, we have to review the history of events that led to this complete control of the media and propaganda, because it didn't happen overnight. Initially, there was a free press in the West, and gradually it eroded and became what is now monopolized, consolidated, concentrated power in the hands of a few super rich corporations.
If I may interject here, I will just share my personal take on this and my story of how I used to be one of those brainwashed masses. I really was. Never questioned the CNN. Always watched it and consumed, and and took it for granted. But that started to change in 2020 with COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So when I started to see all these public hearings, Senate hearings, depositions in the Senate, and of course, those were always followed by a huge outflow of the taxpayers' money towards the CARE Act. If you recall the CARE Act,
yes.
The CARE Act cost the taxpayers trillions of dollars. I don't recall exactly how much, but it was in the trillions. Most of the money went to research pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, if you recall, to produce the vaccine. They were funding the business loans. A lot of those business loans, like the PPP loans, came to find out later on were actually fraudulent. Mm-hmm. Most of these loans are forgivable, so they will never have to be repaid back to the government. So basically, to me as a money investigator, sounds like a scam of huge proportions. So when I saw that, it did seem a little bit staged and somewhat, if I can say somewhat, actually very questionable, but I had no proof. Whatsoever. Things accelerated.
The biggest upward transfer of money to the upper classes. And
correct.
To close to 6 trillion.
6 trillion, the CARE Act was. Okay. So 6 trillion were transferred during 2020-21. Then, of course, next thing you know, February of 22 comes around, and we have the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Watching the mass media and knowing the background of the conflict, where actually I come from both Russia and Ukraine, and knowing that very long story and the U.S. involvement in it, U.S. participation and meddling in those affairs, It was very strange for me to see and watch those news basically naming that conflict and invasion as unprovoked. I mean, yes, the one fact of that puzzle was, yes, it was an invasion. We know that. But let's call it for what it is, very much provoked. But they kept on using that term, unprovoked, unprovoked, unprovoked. And
it
when
didn't start in 2022. It started
of course,
before that. It started with Gorbachev and James Baker, and during the Bush administration, when they promised that NATO wouldn't extend an inch eastern of Germany. So it started in the 90s.
Right.
And then we have the 2014 the Maidan coup, and we have the two Minsk agreement that were violated.
Correct. But none of that was being mentioned during those presentations of the conflict. No. So of course, when an average, Westerner sees bombs flying, buildings being blown up, tanks rolling, this is like a horror show, but it has a background to it. And you guys are directly involved in that. So of course, why would they mention that? Where the plan is to go ahead and send other trillions of dollars towards that. But once again, that money didn't go to Ukraine per se, right? So most of that money went to the military industrial complex, as we know, which is back to the pockets of the shareholders of these companies that are manufacturing the same arms that are killing those Russians and Ukrainians. Exactly. Getting those Ukrainians killed. So when I saw Mr. Zelensky of Ukraine arrive here in Washington, D.C., his first show, and the reason I call it show is because if you look carefully, these presentations by Netanyahu, Zelensky, these standing ovations, they're almost the same. The scenario is almost the same in the Senate there in Washington, D.C. So the speaker, Mr. Zelensky, Mr. Netanyahu, stand up. Of course, nobody questions them. Nobody questions their narrative. And most importantly, the media doesn't question it. And the media, of course, they know historical content of this conflict. They know what happened prior to that. In fact, in the past, over the past 10, 15 years, they were reporting certain things, pieces, very little pieces of the issue.
Like the Nazification of Ukraine.
It was like the Nazification of Ukraine, where
they were talking about Nazis in Ukraine, and now all of a sudden, all the Nazis disappeared.
Oh, we're gone. Yeah, this was not an issue. Like all of a sudden, that was not even a fact. So when you try to access those same old references published by, let's say, Washington Post and all other, Western media, after 2022, they were gone. They were wiped out. Mm-hmm. And if you mention that anywhere on social platforms, you would be banned. So at this point, I realized that there was no free speech here in the West. And unfortunately, the media was completely complicit and involved in the scam.
May I say this? The censorship after the Russian invasion was so severe that even Noam Chomsky stated that it wasn't even during World War II. It wasn't as bad during World War II. He said, "I've never seen such censorship that you are not allowed to report the Russian point of view." And you remember they banned Russia Today in English. They banned the whole program, and many of the journalists that were there are jobless now, and they wiped out all their recordings.
Correct. So I, just trying to be objective as I can and try to consider their standpoint. I would say that, okay, maybe if they were afraid of the spread of fake news, that would justify it. However, removing their own former publications
Exactly.
from the internet and disallowing the mentioning of their own publications, this is mind-boggling. This is the next level of censorship.
Yes.
So what, freedom of speech, and what are you guys talking about here as far as democracy? This became quite clear to me and to many other people that the media was complicit, and I personally decided to boycott them. I stopped watching all CNN, Fox News, Reuters. All of these channels are basically owned by the government, even though they're privately held. These are privately held companies. They have shareholders, they have the board of directors, but somehow I knew at that point, without doing any further research, that they were basically being the propaganda tools owned by the government.
This is all explained in Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent. But we'll get to this later because I want to review the events that preceded Chomsky's book.
Please do. I want to know, and I'm sure viewers want to know, how in the United States of America, which always stood for the freedom of speech, for the freedom of expression, for for democracy and so forth, we've come to this. We've come to this point.
So the use of propaganda in Western societies started with World War I, and most notably, Great Britain was very successful in using propaganda, to the point that even Hitler admired their use of propaganda. So shortly after World War I, we have a cohort of intellectuals here in America, among them Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, and these people started a public relation campaign, which was very, very successful. So first in 1922, Walter Lippmann published his book called Public Opinion: How People Decide the Role of News, Propaganda, and Manufactured Consent in Modern Democracy. As you can see, he coined the term manufactured consent, which was popularized later by Herman and Chomsky in their book. So I can, yes, that's the document, and that's the book. And in the book, Lippmann calls the public the bewildered herd. He was very condescending, and he contends that the bewildered herd should be governed by a special class of elite intellectuals like him, of course. He also claims back in 1922 that in the age of super-fast communications, democracy is obsolete and should be abandoned. That's back in 1922.
That's over 100 years ago.
Yes, that's when the campaign started. And his colleague, Edward Bernays, who, by the way, is the nephew of the notorious Sigmund Freud, Edward Bernays is considered the father of public relations and propaganda. He single-handedly created a whole industry called public relations, which thrives now. You know that in every corporation they have a whole department of public relations.
PR.
That's an euphemism for propaganda. And back then, Bernays was using freely the word propaganda, and he even wrote a book in 1928 called Propaganda. In the book, Bernays claims that that in Western democracy is necessary intelligent and conscious manipulation of the public is essential, especially their opinions and their habits. It's essential for Western democracies. Also, Bernays claims that the public should be governed and manipulated by invisible men, of whom the public haven't heard of. So, in this manner, he proved his point by remaining anonymous after his two very successful public relations campaign. One was persuading women to smoke in the 1930s by flooding the TV with glamorous images of Hollywood stars smoking. And the other campaign was CIA coup in 1953 in Guatemala, which opened the doors for the American United Fruit Company, which started exploiting the population and the resources of the country, and thus the term banana republic. It comes from the United Fruit Company. They which usually means that foreign intervention in countries whose governments were bribed for the benefit of the corporations and for no benefit of the local population, which continues even now in all over the world, mostly now is in Asia. So Bernays was not very well known, even though he had these two very successful campaigns. And his idea of manipulating the public by invisible men is pretty much alive today. And today it's implemented by our technocrats who rule us and who are hiding behind the AI. They now pretend that AI is some sovereign unit that works independently and has nothing to do with them, because they are the Wizard of Oz who controls the AI. So between these two intellectuals and their publications in 1922 and 28, something very curious happened. It was the publishing of Adolf Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, which means My Struggle. Hitler published the book in 1925, and he dedicated two of his chapters on propaganda. Hitler was very interested in propaganda, and he was studying the British propaganda especially. And in volume 1 in his book, the chapter is War Propaganda, where he scrutinizes what the British did, and he actually considers the proper use of propaganda an art. He was admiring the Brits, and he even said that we should. That's the book, and you can see later in the content that he has two chapters dedicated to propaganda.
On propaganda, and I think he was he mastered that thing. Hitler,
to perfection.
He sure did.
Mm-hmm. To perfection. And he, regarding war propaganda, his opinion is that it should be clear, forceful, one-sided, and repetitive in order to be successful. And he also claims that it should be addressed to the lowest mental denomination of the crowd. And he called the public human material, which is a little nicer than Lippmann's bewildered herd. So,
Wow.
and in
Wow. So much regard for the public, huh?
yes. Can you believe that Lippmann was worse than Hitler in regarding the public? And then in the second chapter, which was called War and Organization, he talks about propaganda in peaceful times. And then he turns his attention to the Jewish press. He also was very interested in the Jewish press and the way they handled their propaganda. So according to him, he has a very interesting citation there where he says that, I'm paraphrasing, he says that the Jewish press, they attack from hundreds of quarters simultaneously honorable and decent men by throwing at them mud and filth and using slander as if by some magic formula.
This is Hitler speaking over close to 100 years ago?
Yes, and that's a very precise definition of what's happening now in our media. They're attacking from hundreds of quarters decent people and
Wow.
slandering them. So as if by the magic formula, exactly as if by command, because they take commands from their masters, who are the real owners of the government, the wealthiest corporations. And we'll get to the monopoly of media a little later, because there were other events that happened before that. So in 1945, we have George Orwell, who published his Animal Farm. It took him 2 years to persuade the publishers. Nobody wanted to publish it, but finally it was published without the preface, which was titled The Freedom of the Press. And here is why it was banned, because in this preface, Orwell explains that that's the preface, exactly, yeah. Orwell explains that in Western democracies, censorship is more subtle, including self-censorship. And he says that people are self-censoring, and democracies use social pressure, financial incentives, among other methods, to insert censorship. And that explains why the preface is still not published with the book. And you know that because you own the book.
I own the book. Mm-hmm.
The preface is not there. It still could be found online, but it's never attached to the book. And it is precisely because he exposes the censorship and propaganda in Western democracy.
Do you remember, Tamara, back in the late 80s, when you lived in Bulgaria, perhaps, and
Yeah.
I lived in the old Soviet Union,
Yeah.
where we started to hear little, pieces of information coming from Radio Freedom or Radio Europe.
Yeah, of course, radio.
And we were all dying to get out and hear the truth, right? We were so desperate to know what's happening there in the world. And little did we know that these programs were sponsored and paid for by USAID and Soros organizations, and they were designed exactly to
lure, yes, to lure the populations of the communist countries and to incite insurrection in this country.
To incite the self-destruction, to self-destruct.
because they wanted the markets. They just wanted to extend the markets to Eastern Europe. That's why they destroyed the.
And what better way to destroy a country than that? This is the easiest, the simplest, and the least expensive. Why wage a real war when you can wage an information war?
Exactly, the wars of information, they're still going on.
Big time.
And in 1967, through the FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, we know now that in 1967, a CIA memo 1035-690 was circulated and sent to the CIA agents, instructing them to infiltrate the news media and to that's the document. That was after the assassination of JFK.
Correct.
After publishing the Warren report, and it says there that it's been released in 1993, but it was issued in 1967, and it was called Countering Criticism of the Warren Report, because people weren't buying the theory of the narrative of the magic bullet and the lone assassin, and they were discussing other options, so they had to shut them up, and they advised the
lonely assassin who was conveniently killed immediately thereafter.
Yeah,
so
he was a patsy. He was a patsy. He was, yeah.
Of course, how convenient is that?
But they advised the media to label anybody who questions the narrative conspiracy theorist. And that's how the conspiracy theorists entered the lexicon of the public. And it was thrown around, still is, in order to smear and stigmatize people who question the
like us. We would be the conspiracy theorists, right?
Officially we would be labeled that. So anybody who questions or deviates from the narrative, it's labeled conspiracy theorists. So they had a very good use of this term. And we know now, thanks to the FOIA, which was released later, 30 years later. And I believe that it has to do, the release of this document has to do with Oliver Stone's movie JFK, which was released in 1991, and it had a big impact on the public, and even caused the Congress to start a new investigation on the assassination of JFK. And I think they released a bunch of documents back then after the, and as a result, we know about this dispatch 1035, which instructs people to be called conspiracy theorists. That's
however, we still don't know the truth, even though they know, they have it, they know the JFK files, the Epstein files. Nothing has been released to the public because the public would be outraged.
Yeah, they just released the things we already knew. Nothing new was released. Yeah, and they classified back the most important information.
Of course.
So it was a theater. It was a performance, of course. And then the next milestone event were two memorandums, one in 1971 and one in 1975. The 1971 was issued by Judge Louis Powell, who urged who instructed actually the media to instructed big business to buy the top intellectual reputations of the most prestigious universities, so they can add credit to the business ideas and the business research. So that's how it's done. As a result, hundreds of intellectuals entered the universities, and they all were funded by big business, and their research was influenced by big business to benefit big business. That's how it's done. That's the one memorandum. And the other one was similar, even though it was issued by the Trilateral Commission, which is founded by David Rockefeller in 1971. So the other memorandum was criticizing institutions like, it's called, the Crisis of Democracy, and instructed institutions like universities and churches and media to do their job of brainwashing young people. They were complaining that there is too much democracy. Many people are participating in the government, and that's not good for the business. And this was a backlash. This was backlash resulting from the human rights movements in the 60s. And it was against the achievements of the human rights movements because they led to opening the doors of the universities to African Americans, women, and Native Americans, they didn't have access to them before. So as a result, the big business fought back, and they issued this campaign trying to roll back democracy, which was bad for business. And the next event was also very important. In 1977, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist Carl Bernstein exposed the CIA Operation Mockingbird, which was the infiltration of 400 journalists. They recruited 400 journalists and infiltrated the newsrooms all over the United States. The main newspapers like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Time magazine, Newsweek magazine, etc. And in this way, they just promoted their agenda for decades without anybody knowing, without anybody suspecting. Ironically, now they don't have to do that because they openly hire CIA assets, like examples, James Clapper of the NSA, or Michael Hayden from the CIA, or even Anthony Blinken, the Department of Defense, who was, they were paid contributors to CNN. So they are doing it.
Anthony Blinken was the State Department. He was the head of the State Department.
The State Department, yeah. Mm-hmm. So all these people who are government agents work for the news openly. They're paid contributors to the most popular channel, CNN.
While any opposing view, such as Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the world-renowned professor who travels the world and the whole world hears him and wants to hear, while CNN, Fox News, Reuters refuse to invite him. They don't want to invite him.
Never. Same with Noam Chomsky. He hasn't been on TV since the 70s. They're just banned from the mainstream media because they're,
of course.
Yes. And now we come to 1983, where Ben Bagikian, who was a journalist in the Washington Post, and he's famous with delivering the Pentagon paper, during his tenure at the Washington Post. He, along with Daniel Ellsberg, the late Daniel Ellsberg, they published the Pentagon paper, and in his book published in 1983, Bagikian warns us that prior to the publishing of the book, there were hundreds of owners of the media, and in 1983, the media owners were down to 50. And by the time of the 7th edition of the book in 2004, the media owners were already 5.
Only
Only 5 owners. And that is today still with little changes, but they still, the media are owned by 5 corporations. These are Disney, Comcast, AT&T, Viacom, and News Corporation. Okay, so the next milestone is Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky's book, Manufacturing Consent. In the book, the authors expose the 5 media filters and how these filters help the media to become tools of propaganda. And these tools are ownership, advertisement, experts, flack, and common enemy. The ownership we already covered. It's monopolized. It's consolidated.
The 5 companies.
5 companies, yes. That's clear. The advertisement, they need funds because they can never sustain their business by just membership. So they need different revenue, and this is advertisers. Advertisers usually are, in our media, usually are the pharmaceuticals and the military industrial complex. In other words, big business, Wall Street, etc. So that's filter number 2. Number 3, the so-called experts are presented to the public as independent observers, whereas in reality, they're working either for the government or for the Secret Service, and their ties are never reviewed, they're never revealed, and we hear a biased opinion presented to us as independent expertise.
Just like that Anthony Blinken being very independent, so to speak.
Yeah, like Anthony Blinken being a contributor to main news outlet. And this is a conflict of interest that is outrageous, but never revealed. And the next filter, flack, there are consequences for deviation from the script and the narrative. And these consequences or punishment vary. They vary from losing access to power, to being fired, to more extreme cases like imprisoning or assassination. And I can give you examples of the more extreme punishment, like Julian Assange, who was imprisoned for 5 years in high security prison, Belmarsh in London, or Gary Webb, who is famous with revealing the CIA ties to the Nicaraguans Contra and them funding them with drug money and flooding the streets of LA with cocaine, and later using the money to fund the Contras. For this reporting, Gary Webb's career was destroyed. He was smeared and out of job for years, and finally, because he didn't ill and didn't give up. He was finally suicided. He was found with 2 bullets in his head, and it was ruled suicide.
Of
So
course.
these are the most extreme forms of plaque, which is the fourth filter, and the fifth filter is common enemy. And we know that the common enemy always changes, but it's always there. It was first Russia during the Cold War, then it was terrorists during the war on terror, and then now it's back to Russia, and now it's the Palestinians. It's always somebody that we have to unite against and to be distracted from the real problems of the daily life. So these are the 5 filters summarized and exposed by the authors through this book. And there is a 5-minute video directed and narrated by Amy Goodman. It was a very, very powerful video, but it was only showed on the Al Jazeera channel. It's never published by our media. But anyway, the Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky dedicated their book to an Australian scholar and journalist, Alex Carey, and they consider him a pioneer in the research of propaganda. Alex Carey is a very important figure, and in the 1980s, he wrote an essay called Managing Public Opinion, the Corporate Offense. This essay was being circulated among dissidents like Chomsky and Eldberg, among others, for years before it was finally published in 1995, posthumously, 8 years after Alex Carey's passing. But in this essay, Carey explains that the 3 major developments of the 20th century, and they are the growth of democracy, the growth of corporatism, and the growth of propaganda. And propaganda was actually created to counter the democracy, which was infringing the rights of the corporations. So they invented propaganda as their shield from democracy. But based on these 3 main developments, Alex Carey explains that big business infiltrates the media, and the goals of the propaganda, the goals of the corporate propaganda are to instill in people's consciousness that free enterprise is a cherished value, and that big business is always positive, and that the enemy is government control of the corporations. And that's how they vilified all the regulations, and that's their main goal, is to eliminate all regulations so they can go rampant as they do now and poison people and poison the environment and do whatever they want without consequences.
Well, Tamara, we are running out of time. So we both know now that the Western media isn't free. And we both know now, as you have presented, a very strong documentary evidence of it being complicit. What does the average viewer, average consumer, average guy who worked all day and doesn't have the time to do his own research, to look for, background, scenario, background story, history of conflict, and so forth, what do they do how do we solve this problem?
Well, the simplest thing to do is to stay away from mainstream media. Never, ever trust mainstream media, never listen to them, because they only spew propaganda. But let me just say the last nail on the coffin of killing democracy and the freedom of the press was the 1996 Telecommunication Act, which actually lifted the regulations of ownership of different cross ownership of different stations or different mediums. So this opened the door for big merges that led to the today's 5 owners of
The consolidation. And of course, they will tell you that the consolidation was necessary to keep up the profits, to fend against competition and so forth.
Yeah.
But of course, the lesser the number of owners, the easier it is to control them, right?
Yes, that was it. Yes.
So I would say that alternative media outlets like Michael's show, other sources on YouTube, on Rumble, that are not so biased and present from the ground is the answer.
So many independent investigative journalists. I would suggest Whitney Webb. She's awesome. Max Blumenthal, Abby Martin. They've been there for us all this time. Noam Chomsky, of course, but he's out. There are plenty of dissident journalists, and they could be found, even though they have to move a lot because they get banned from one platform. They have to jump from platform to platform, but they can be found. And even comedians like Jimmy Dore or Lee Kemp, they tell the truth, and it's more beneficial for the public to listen to them than to the mainstream media.
Of course, I agree.
My advice. Yes.
All right, Tamara. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Maybe our future podcast as well.
Of course, because we will be presenting unbiased and unfiltered and mostly documented news and events from now on.
Can you show the picture?